helplines if people have questions about how to kind of practically exercise their rights. And also there are various NGOs and others that are kind of working on tools to try and facilitate individuals using these rights more often.
So if the company doesn't provide me with the information I require, I can go and complain to the Data Protection Authority, and there's also NGOs that might help me and provide information such as consumer groups or privacy groups and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about company obligations? Because we talked earlier that companies and public authorities have more obligations that they had before. Can you give us an overview of those?
Yeah, so to kind of go with these rights are these more stringent obligations on companies. And one of the ways that data protection law works is that it requires those processing data to comply with certain principles. And one of the new principles that Gdpr introduces is what's called the accountability principle. And this is basically a requirement that if you are going to be processing personal data, you need to be able to demonstrate how you comply with the law. This is basically putting the onus on you to justify what it is that you're doing with your data, why you're doing that, and to record that. So there's various obligations in GDPR that kind of assist with that. So for example, certain organizations now have to appoint data protection officers to kind of oversee how they comply with GDPR. There's a requirement to carry out impact assessments when you're planning a project, for example, or using new technology that could impact on people's right to privacy and data protection.
So how my development affects people's privacy, that's essentially what an impact assessment is.
So looking at people's rights and what the impact might be. There are certain record-keeping obligations that companies now have to keep up with. There's this requirement of data protection by design and by default, which is essentially this idea that you really need to think about data protection for the very beginning, and you need to design it into your systems, into your projects, into your planning. And the default should be that people's data is protected and it's not, for example, used in ways that they wouldn't expect. And there is another requirement which is new in certain countries in the EU, and that is that data breach reporting will become mandatory. So previously we've seen a lot of data breaches being uncovered far down the line, but now it's going to become mandatory for organizations to report where there is a data breach.
So if you have a big scandal like the one we had recently with Uber and Equifax, they will need to report it in time and notify all their users.
Yeah, so
and
if
then
there's...
you can take precautions.
Exactly, so if there's a risk, they actually need to be reporting that to authorities in 72 hours. So that really kind of speeds up the time scale for reporting it. And then if there is a high risk, then they need to be actually reaching out to individuals and informing them.
I have one more question to you, and maybe other colleagues will want to ask. A lot has been said, particularly in the US press, about this thing about consent and control. The GDPR is all about consent and control and nothing else. Is that true?
No, so consent is an important part of GDPR and of data protection regulation, but it's just one part of it. So as I was saying, if you are processing people's personal data that is doing anything with it, you need to be able to justify it and have kind of a legal justification for doing that. So consent is just one of 6 justifications for using people's data, and it's an important one. And if you are going to be relying on people's consent, then the threshold is really kind of upped by GDPR. It's supposed to be specific, informed, and freely given, and you're supposed to have given this kind of affirmative action. You're supposed to have actually done something to consent. It's no longer the case that you can just rely on someone's implied consent or these kind of pre-tick boxes. That's something that just won't meet this threshold. And then these other conditions that there are, they all require consideration of whether what you're doing is necessary. So thinking about what are you actually doing with this data, and could you use it in a way or do that same thing in a way that interferes less with people's privacy. So for example, another condition is where it's necessary for the performance of a contract. So if you buy something online, they might need your address, for example, to deliver.
To send you the stuff.
Yeah, but that doesn't automatically mean they could also send you marketing materials, for example.
So if with an energy company or with your mobile phone company, you have to give them certain data for them to perform that service, but they can't necessarily ask you much more details that they don't need for that. Okay, thank you very much. Any questions, any more questions to Ailidh? Yeah?
We've got a couple of questions from the internet. What can we expect following the implementation of GDPR to the quote-unquote tracking search engines like Google or Bing?
We expect with tracking, do you want to answer that? I mean, I can start and you can continue. That's a very good question. We've seen a lot of sort of movement on the part of Google and other big US companies, basically sending us more information about their privacy controls and what you can do with their dashboards and how you can set your privacy settings. And that is considered compliance with GDPR. We need to examine that much more closely. We don't think that that is entirely in conformity with GDPR, but that's something to be watched over in more detail, yes?
I think that this goes back again to companies being able to explain what it is that they're doing with people's data and why they're doing it. And GDPR is forcing them to kind of re-examine what it is that they're doing and to kind of explain that in a clearer way. And that's where I think civil society and others will play an important role in monitoring the way that companies are implementing GDPR. So through, for example, updating those privacy notices, what are they actually saying that they're doing? And GDPR does, put limits on how you use people's data. You do have to have these justifications. So if you are tracking someone, for example, across devices, what is your basis for doing that? And that's, I think, something that will be looked into as we go forward.
And interestingly, I've seen a blog recently from the European Protection Supervisor who said that a lot of these companies are not acting entirely legally because they are telling you what they're going to do, but they don't actually give you a choice. So they're fulfilling part of their obligation in being transparent what they do, but they're not being entirely in conformity, because if you don't like what they do, you don't have the service. And if that happens with a giant like Google, that can have an impact on people because it's an important service and an important search engine.
Yeah, so I think, if it's with like data-intensive business models, it's not necessarily business as usual. Post GDPR, there is like a kind of thorough re-examination of how data is being used, and I think that both regulators and civil society will play a part in that. And I think that you have these kind of tools to look at data protection. So individuals can complain to regulators, they can take action, and then there's also the role of civil society in holding those processing data to account.
And just to mention, GDPR is not perfect. It's not the best thing since sliced bread. There are many vague provisions in there that need a lot of guidelines. And I think a lot of its provisions will also be tested in courts, because that's the only way. With a very big piece of legislation like this, when there are 28 member states involved, there's bound to be compromise. So the result was compromise with unclarity in some instances. So we'll see how things develop. So what was the other question?
I've got two more, actually. What is the impact of GDPR on countries which don't have any privacy legal framework or privacy protection mechanism in place? For instance, Pakistan.
Shall I start? And do you want to start? Yeah.
So I think that whilst GDPR is a piece of EU legislation, it does have a wider impact, and in part that's because it has this kind of extraterritorial scope, which Anna mentioned, and that's where it does apply to companies that are operating outside the EU just because they process data of those in the EU. But it also impacts on countries outside the EU in the sense of if countries are looking to develop their own data protection legislation or the reforming data protection legislation, they may look to certain provisions in GDPR because it is one of the newer data protection frameworks. And what GDPR does as well is it places limits on the transfer of people's personal data outside the EU. The EU see the EU system as a strong system, and they say that if you are going to transfer people's data outside, you have to have certain safeguards in place. And one of the ways that they say that you might safeguard data is only sending it to countries which have kind of these equivalent standards of protection. And that's what's known as kind of adequacy decisions. So that's where the EU Commission looks at a country, looks at the data protection legislation and other legislation in that country, for example, around human rights, and decides whether they think that it's kind of on par with the standards in the EU. And where countries have adequacy, or where they're looking for adequacy, that will also mean that GDPR has an impact on the way that legislation develops there.
So essentially, in the case of Pakistan, if businesses in Pakistan and the country generally wants to do good business with the EU, it will need to demonstrate that it can safeguard data properly. And that can be done either by the whole country developing laws, or it can be done by individual businesses safeguarding people's data better. And I'll give you another example. For example, in a recent trade deal between Japan and the European Union, Japan improved its data protection legislation in order to be able to do better trade with the European Union. So in a way, better standards in the EU can act as an incentive for other countries to get better legislation and safeguard their consumers and citizens better.
And one final question from the internet. It's a very similar question, but just in case you want to add anything. What can we expect as a citizen from Latin America regarding GDPR? The question has heard that, for example, Facebook would adopt the legislation for Latin America. So anything in particular you can say about?
There's an important issue to add there. If Facebook has to implement GDPR for Europeans, it should do the same for Latin American people. There is no reason for a company to discriminate between its users on the basis of where they live. And yes, maybe, I mean, there's some Latin American countries that have good data protection law. For example, Uruguay has signed Convention 108, but not all of them. So what we're saying is, Facebook, please voluntarily do the same for Latin American people as you have to do for Europeans. Yeah?
I think, yeah, that's the point. If you, as a company, are kind of putting in place policies and processes and systems in order to kind of up protections for one group of people, are you really going to take this deliberate choice to lower protections for others? And that's not to say they should just look to GDPR in the EU, but to the highest standards available. So where you have stronger provisions in other countries, those should also be taken into account. And it's very disappointing to see certain companies not kind of rising to that challenge and not committing to that. And there's been companies that have given very vague commitments to the spirit of GDPR or GDPR-like, but there's also been a kind of focus on privacy settings and controls. And kind of as we've explained with kind of the brief overview of the law, it's not just about settings and controls. It's much more comprehensive. It's much more about the comprehensive data practices of a company. So we really are kind of calling on those companies that are caught within the scope and are already, making changes to do that across the board and really give users kind of the highest protections that they can. So that's something that we'll be looking into kind of going forward.
We think that Facebook and other companies like this are being dishonest when they say they will do the same for everybody, because as Ailidh said, that just doing better visible controls is not everything. But also they make a lot of money out of people's personal data. I've read somewhere an estimate that Facebook makes $85 per head for every resident of the United States, and $25 for Europe. So, you know, they're obviously trying not to give up that advantage easily. But what we are saying is that data protection is an enabler, it's not a barrier. You gain people's trust, and more people will come to you if you do that. So, yeah. From the audience here.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I have one question which maybe you can touch upon. What happens if a company doesn't comply with GDPR? What is going to get? What kind of sanctions is going to risk to receive, and by whom? Thank you.
So as we were saying, if they don't comply, then there's kind of various options for kind of taking action. And one important part of GDPR is giving regulators more powers and much more stringent enforcement mechanisms. And part of this is penalties. The penalties have been up massively. So now the highest level of penalty is either 20 million euros or 4% of annual global turnover, whichever is greater. And this is a big increase. And for example,